Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. Well, to the surprise of nobody that was really paying attention, Joe Biden has picked Kamala Harris. It is pronounced Kamala Harris, by the way. Just a note to Tucker Carlson, who seems kind of thin-skinned about all of this. So let's sort this out because we have 83 days to go until the election, followed by another 78 days until the inauguration day. And lots going on, but this is the big story of the day. So we're bringing in the big guns. We're bringing in Sarah Longwell to talk about all of this. Thanks for joining me, Sarah. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.
So I actually played this game yesterday because I know some people who actually are not political wonks, and which is rare in our world. And I said, okay, I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but can you name Hillary Clinton's running mate? And it's like, no. Well, look, Maureen Dow didn't know it. So, but do you remember where you were when Tim Kaine was named as Hillary Clinton's running mate? Do you remember where you were, what you were doing?
Can't say I do.
See, no. See, this is one of those things. I can remember where I was when Barack Obama named Joe Biden. I was actually at the ballpark watching a Brewer game. I remember where I was when Mitt Romney named Paul Ryan because, believe it or not, at that moment, I thought this may be the pinnacle of your political life. No, I remember that. But Tim Kaine doesn't even register with me. I don't even know where I was when Pence. But this feels different. Okay, so let's just dive into it. Your thoughts on Joe Biden picking Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I had sort of, JVL and I had talked about this on our little secret podcast, where my take was that I thought he was going to pick Kamala. And the reason was, you start with Kamala. Everyone thinks it's going to be Kamala. And then you say, well, but she didn't do very well. And she's got some liabilities as a former prosecutor with progressives. And then you start running through all the other options. Gretchen Whitmer, Karen Bass, Tammy Duckworth. And, at each one you think, oh, well, that's interesting. And then you think it through and then you come up with some Achilles heel reason why it's not good. And then you kind of circle back around and you go, Kamala Harris, like that seems about right. And that's where you land. And so I think, I've always thought, having sort of spent a lot of time with soft Trump supporters, talking to them, thinking through what is, how would they be persuaded to vote for a Democrat? I knew the vice presidential choice for Joe Biden was going to be different from other VP choices because of Joe Biden's age, because of what it signals about the future of the Democratic Party, that it was going to matter. And it was something that people said in sort of the focus groups I do, that it was going to matter. But I knew that the main thing that Joe Biden had to do was to do no harm. Right? Not pick somebody that was too far left, that would give the Trump campaign something to really grab onto and to say, because they're trying to run a very specific narrative, which is Joe Biden is owned by the socialists, right? And every Republican you talk to, they've absorbed this talking point. And so the vice presidential candidate had to be somebody they couldn't hang that socialist mantle on. And I think that she is a do no harm pick. I think she's sort of, everybody says, the progressives say, okay. The moderates say, okay. Maybe soft Trump supporters say, and that's fine. That's fine for this moment.
I tend to agree with that. I think there's going to be a little bit of sifting out because, and I want to get your take on these soft Trump supporters or the Republican voters against Trump type. But what I found the most reassuring was that it wasn't a gaffe. That in many ways, Joe Biden, did the conventional thing. He didn't try to do anything clever. He didn't try a Sarah Palin move. And also by process of elimination, she was the obvious choice. I mean, it seemed pretty obvious to me a couple of weeks ago that it had to be her, unless somebody does something completely screwy. But I agree with David Axelrod and you that she may not be the most comfortable fit as a governing partner, but she was the safest pick. I went back and looked at everything that I'd written about her, and I've actually never written anything nice about her. I ripped her for her handling of the Kavanaugh hearing. I wrote a piece for the Weekly Standard. I also was critical of her position that Twitter should ban Donald Trump, but I don't think any of that stuff really matters that much. But so I guess I am getting a little bit of pushback from people going, I want to vote I wanted to vote for Joe Biden, but she does seem too radical, and this does really open the door to the left to take over because by choosing her, she's going to be the next president, and I'm uncomfortable with her. So are you? What do you pick up on these focus groups about this? Does this actually move any votes one way or another? Does it make it harder for I'll start with this. Does it make it harder for Biden to sell to that Republican voter against Trump, the right of center voter that's been disillusioned with Trump?
Yeah, so I think I've got good news and bad news on that front. So I did a focus group just last week. I think it was last Wednesday or Thursday, with swing state voters and then Pennsylvania voters. So it was, and they were all women, all people who had voted for Trump, but rate him as doing a very bad job. So these are your gettable people. And in those groups, there were big chunks of them that were undecided. In both groups, there were people who were definitely voting for Biden. I think there was one person out of the two groups who was definitely voting for Trump, which doesn't bode, you know, particularly well for Trump. But I ran the vice presidential sort of top line choices by people, and I will say that there were two people who said that who were planning to vote for Joe Biden, who really were out on Trump, who said that Kamala, they really didn't like her. Um, and so that's the bad news. The good news, I would say, is that, and I've probably talked about this a little bit before on the podcast in relation to the focus groups, is just how little people have been paying attention up until this point. And so there is room, a ton of room. I mean, I would say Joe Biden is still widely undefined among this group of voters, let alone Kamala Harris. Like, people are going to just start tuning in really here. And so I think they're going to evaluate her on her performance going forward. And there's going to be a battle. Trump is going to try to define her as somebody who is radical and far left. And they don't want somebody who's radical and far left because these are sort of by nature Republicans. But Kamala has a lot of charm. And she does, when she's in her element, come off as, I think, somebody who could be a very attractive candidate to suburban women, and could be seen as, oh no, look at that great smile, and look at that, she just laughs a lot. She conveys competence. And so I think if she spends the next 2.5 months being the best version of herself and a good sort of soldier for Biden, helping to sell him, I think she could be a real asset. And so there's a lot of white space there for her to play with.
There's two competing narratives out there. Because what you said is fascinating. That there are so many people who have really not engaged on this yet. Because I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom that people have really made up their minds that this is one of those years where people have had 4 years to marinate in Trumpism, and they've made up their mind that there's not a lot that's going to happen between now and November. But you're suggesting that from these focus groups, you're figuring out that in fact it's not as set as it might look. Because I'm looking at these polls, and the extraordinary thing is how immovable they are. I mean, how solid they are. So that Donald Trump has his floor, he's got his ceiling, and it's been there for 4 years. Joe Biden has had a lead. It has been unusually durable. It seems to be around 6 to 8 points, and nothing seems to move it. So, which of these narratives is true? Because you don't see a lot of fluctuation.
Yeah. So, but in all those polls, there's always a bucket in there of people who don't know or are undecided. Or let's talk about, and I think, for me, I'm dealing with a very specific subset of
Right.
voters, which are voters who are typically tribal Republican voters. And so they're usually a lock for the Republicans, but they really dislike Donald Trump, but they also really dislike Democrats. And so you've got this particular group of voters that I'm obsessed with because of my Republican Voters Against Trump project. I'm constantly thinking, how do you get these voters? And so I talk to them all the time. But so these are the ones who really sit there thinking, I don't know. And they just want more data, right? They want to know more about Joe Biden. They want to know more about Kamala Harris. And I'll tell you, there's sort of two buckets I would put this specific group in of undecideds. There's the people who really haven't been paying attention. And that people say it all the time. They're like, I'm checked out of politics. It's so toxic. I'm so just tired. Everything's so relentlessly negative. I just haven't even been paying attention, but I'm going to vote. It's my civic duty, and I'm going to start doing my research, and I'm going to learn about it. So that's sort of one bucket, is just I haven't really been paying attention, but I'm going to vote. I'm going to learn. And then there's the sort of people I described before, where they've always voted Republican but hate Trump, but they're scared of what the Democrats were going to do. And those are the people where I think if Kamala and Joe Biden are over the next 2.5 months able to project a uniting message, something that doesn't seem overly scary, that they reject some of the further, hey, we're going to defund the police and immediately pass Medicare for all. That Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that's not what they're going to do. And I think if they can project that to these voters and get them comfortable, that they really, those people are very much gettable for them.
On the other hand, of course, Trump and the Republicans will dump hundreds of millions of dollars to convince those voters that, in fact, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are radical and they are dangerous. And we just see from Axios today that they're dumping huge high seven-figure buys into some of these swing states, talking about how Joe Biden is in the thrall of left-wing politics. And that's also aimed at these kind of voters, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And so the question is and I think right now, right, everybody's trying to do this air war to define things. But ultimately, there's going to be real world events where people get to decide whether or not they believe those narratives are true, right? So is Joe Biden senile? Has he lost it? So this is something I hear in the focus groups a lot, where
You
people are
do.
like, oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that is something that more than anything else is sticking, where they're like, and it gets framed in almost a concerned kind of way, like, I don't know, he's pretty old and he just might not be up to it. And that kind of thing, it allows people to say that they're not voting for Joe Biden just because they're worried, and it makes them feel okay about their decision. Now, the problem is for Trump that the more that you say Joe Biden is senile, he can't string two words together, if he stands up at a debate and he totally holds his own, then they have made a mistake in lowering expectations to the point where if Joe Biden's not drooling on himself and he's competently handing issues, like, people will make up their minds based on the data that they see with their own eyes, and they will start tuning in. So there's actually, and I think that's why we've known that there are some known unknowns, right? And we're starting to tick through them. One of them was, we know he's going to choose a vice presidential candidate, and that person is going to make a difference to some degree in the way that this sort of whole nomination team is characterized. So we've come to that inflection point, and we see that he's done no harm. He's right.
Right.
He's got this big lead, and he feels confident in that. He's picked somebody that is kind of a consensus pick, and so that's good. So the next inflection points are going to be things like the debates, where we really do see these candidates, and there's going to be a lot of attention around that, and there's going to be a lot of new people tuning in to make decisions. And so I think that's, yes, people are going to dump billions into this election. It will very likely be the most expensive election in the history of the United States. But there are some, and we already see this happening, you can only make narratives stick if they're kind of true.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the reasons that the Joe Biden senile thing sticks is because people do see, clips of him, with the gaffes or seeming like, kind of stumbling around. Now, of course, Trump has many of those clips as well.
Sure,
So the
sure.
question, will, on something like the debates, that's really going to matter, where Americans tune in, or at least they see the news coverage about it. And if the news coverage, the dominant narrative coming out of it is Joe Biden held his own, he was great, he looks sharp enough, like, that's what he needs.
No, I think you're right. I think it's a huge mistake for the Trump folks to lower the expectations so much. You used an interesting word, though. That people are looking for a reason that will allow them to vote for Biden or allow them to vote for Trump. So you said that they're looking for data. Are they looking for data, or are they looking for excuses to do what they want to do? That
Yep.
I want to vote for Biden. I need one reason to do that. Or these are people who, because they are tribal, are looking for some excuse to say, well, I really hate Donald Trump, but because of this, I'm just going to have to go with him because I can't go with those radical socialist Democrats. So they're looking for an excuse to do what you want anyway.
So I think that's a really good point. But think about a person who lives in central Pennsylvania, and they're living more or less in Trump country. But you're a woman who lives in the exurbs, and you think Donald Trump is loathsome. But you've always voted Republicans. You also think Democrats are scary, and everyone around you talks about how Democrats are scary and they're socialists. But also, you watch Donald Trump and you think he's gross, and you're sitting there kind of trying to figure out like what data points are you inputting. So this really worked against Hillary Clinton in 2016 because everybody, the cultural soup that people swam in was that Hillary Clinton was uniquely corrupt, uniquely vile. They all hated the Clintons. It was taken as faith that if you were a Republican, you lived in these areas, you hated the Clintons. And so people just couldn't get there to vote for her. If Joe Biden creates an environment, if the environment is, well, now we've seen 3.5 years of Trump and we all agree he is a jerk and, there's a lot of things he's doing that are bad. The economy's in the toilet. We have this mismanaged pandemic and I see these things in front of my face. I am feeling the personal consequences of them. And this other guy presents a rational, reasonable, capable alternative, then I think you're right that people are looking for permission to maybe they want to do something that they feel like they can defend in their peer groups.
Right.
Right? And so Joe Biden has to give them enough cover that the antipathy is not so large that they feel like they're an outgroup, a total outgroup in their peer groups when they suggest that they're going to vote for Joe Biden. And frankly, that's the essential part of what Republican voters against Trump, our project is trying to do. It's all about permission structures. It's all about giving people this other tribe that they can belong to in which they hold on to their Republican identity, but vote for Joe Biden in this unique circumstance because Donald Trump is uniquely terrible.
Okay, let's take one step back. If that realizing that people, unlike on Twitter, are have not been paying that much attention. So when a lot of voters are looking at Kamala Harris and they don't know any details about her criminal justice background, they don't really remember what her position on healthcare was. They don't really know where she stands on infrastructure legislation, any of that stuff. What they know is that she is a Black woman. How does that play? Let's go right into it because the race card is being played. We're not even 24 hours into this, and the race card is being played all over the place. So give me your sense. We've never had this before on a national ticket. So it is uncharted territory. How does the presence of a Black woman affect this race, particularly when I think it's reasonable assumption to think that she may be the first Black woman president of the United States.
Yeah. Look,
Upsides, downsides.
right. So I think that we have in the age of Trump, and let's be clear, you and I would have probably defended the Republican Party 5 years ago on charges of, it's a totally racist party.
Right.
But in more recent years, we might say, oh my gosh, Donald Trump is active. The dog whistles are bullhorns and we can see it. It is clear. And there's no doubt that there is a certain portion of his base that not only tolerates it, but seems to crave it. And that's a huge, horrible realization to come to. At the same time, when you are talking about especially college-educated voters in the suburbs who are right-leaning independents or sort of soft, Republican voters, you look at Kamala Harris, her background as a prosecutor, a lot of the things that are liabilities for her on the progressive left are the kinds of things that make her totally, palatable for kind of this suburban profile.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I mean, this is why Republicans are having a little bit of a difficult time just getting their arms around Kamala because they can't decide
she's on crime.
She's a cop. She's a cop. She's an aggressive prosecutor, or is she a radical left-wing activist who wants to defund the police? Well, she can't be both. And I think to the degree that she, in this moment when we are talking about policing, when there is deep, and I'll tell you, in the focus groups, you would be heartened, I think, to listen to a lot of these women and how appalled they are by the way that Donald Trump behaved during the George Floyd killings. And I'll tell you something. I'll just tell you a quick story about the focus groups, which is I've done so many of them at this point that I'm getting repeat people. And so there's people that I saw in real life when I was behind the glass. So this just happened where last week I did it. And there was a young woman whose name I'm not going to give, but I had seen her probably 7 or 8 months ago. Because it was back Susan Glasser from the New Yorker when she was doing a piece. She was there too. So we all saw this young woman and she stuck out. I never forgot what she said because she was at the time saying, I'm going to vote for Trump again because it's better to vote for the poison you know than the poison you don't know. Okay. So she said that phrase and I just really stuck with me about the way that people think about stuff. She's in the group again so last week. And it's clear she has moved way further against Trump. I'm listening to her the whole thing. Now, she doesn't, and I'm moderating now, so she doesn't recognize me, but I recognize her. And so I listen to her through the whole group. And at the end, I say, hey, you don't remember me because I was behind the glass, but I've seen you before. And I remember something that you told me. And I tell her the poison line and she nods. And I say, but you seem to have moved a whole bunch since then. And she says, yeah, she got caught during the pandemic sort of with her family down south. And she said when George Floyd got killed, they were kind of had Fox News on all the time. And she listened to the way that they were talking and they were very much on the police's side. And she was horrified. And she's young. She's in her 20s, clearly. And she just says she was so sad for him and so horrified by the police being sent in and them gassing protesters, and she just so disagreed with her family that she just couldn't see herself voting for Trump again. She wasn't sure about the Democrats, but to me, I heard it a lot. I've done a lot of focus groups since the George Floyd killing, and these women that I'm talking to really are horrified by the racial division. They're sad about it. It affects them deeply. And I would say more than the pandemic, more than the economic pain, that has been something that has really taken that demographic that was already kind of didn't like Trump, but they were, tribal Republican voters, their families were Republican, their culture's Republican, to just say, like, I actually don't like what I'm seeing. It's too much.
Let me read you one of Donald Trump's tweets from this morning. You may have seen it because he's become obsessed about the same kind of voters that you have been talking about, this suburban housewife. I don't know why he keeps referring to the suburban housewife, but he even puts it in quotes. So this is what he tweeted out about 2 hours ago from our taping here. The suburban housewife will be voting for me. They want safety and are thrilled that I ended the long-running program where low-income housing would invade their neighborhood. Biden would reinstall it in a bigger form with Cory Booker in charge! Exclamation point. I have to admit that the subtlety of that kind of overwhelmed me, because why Cory Booker? Why Cory Booker? Why not Joe Biden? Why not somebody else? It's almost like he's sitting around with Mercedes Schlapp and going, hey, Mercedes, give me the name of some scary black man that I can say that I'm going to protect the suburban housewife against a big black man. I mean, I'm sorry. Am I going too far? Am I over the top here? That the president's tweets is he is, as you put it, way past the dog whistle here.
Yeah, way past the dog whistle. It's also funny to choose Cory Booker and be like, this is a scary black man. Cory Booker's like whole thing is, if you've watched him at all, he's like, his whole thing is love. His whole thing is how much he loves everybody, and it comes through in his persona. He's like the gentlest, sweetest. I mean, to me, he's almost corny in how he is.
But
and so, like, it's sort of,
why
it's
did Trump
totally
choose
absurd.
him then? Why did he choose him? Is there any other possible explanation?
No. Of course you're right. Like the idea. So people who want to defend Trump on the racism charge. So I think you have to push me pretty far before I'm willing to like accuse somebody of racism. But I'm happy to call Trump a racist, because we're not talking about each individual instance. We are capable of looking at his comments in aggregate. And in aggregate, between his smear of Barack Obama as, othering him as somebody who is not from this country with his whole birth certificate, which is essentially how he launched his political career in the first place, to telling congresswomen of color to go back to where they came from, which of course most of them were born in America, to, whether it's S-hole countries, you can pick many things.
Yeah, he is convinced, though, that this is how he's going to win the suburbs, that suburban women are scared of low-income black people. Will that work?
No, because Donald Trump thinks that suburban, he's decided that everybody's as racist as he is.
Right.
And he's wrong about that. He is genuinely, in my opinion, wrong about that. I also think, forget how stupid is it to call I talk to these suburban women all the time. Most of them work. Most of them are not housewives. And so now they're not reading his tweets, because if there's another thing I've learned in these focus groups, it's that they're not on Twitter and they don't follow, his tweeting particularly closely. But he's got this fake thing in his head. Now, I will say he's got this fake image of who these people are. Now, I will say that the Democrats, and this is something for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that they're going to have to do, which is I hear it from every Republican. I was just moderating a group yesterday of women, Republican women who are running for Congress right
Mm,
now. And they are have very much internalized a couple of data points, and you'll hear it from all the Republicans. One is that the Democrats are socialists, and they throw around the word socialism pretty wantonly. And the other thing is that it is in these Democratic-led cities and Democratic-led states where you see the rioting, the looting, the civil unrest. And I do think that something that is happening is that the George Floyd killing now, because every 5 days is an eternity now in news cycles, what's happening is that the protests are becoming divorced from their animating,
right.
initial thing that started them. And so it now there is a deep sympathy, I think, I was listening. There was a woman in the focus group who was talking, and she's always voted Republican. She's Christian. She's deeply pro-life, but she was sitting there being like, I realized when this killing happened that it was time for me to start listening to other voices, that I had to start listening to my African American friends because they've had an experience that I don't understand, and I need to learn more about this. Okay, so that is how people are talking in the suburbs.
Mm,
But
mm.
but nobody wants to see wanton violence, looting, rioting, especially. I think there was a real sense of openness to the level of anger over George Floyd, but we're getting to the point now where it just looks like cities on fire, and people don't. There's no longer a reason that they're connecting to it,
So
and
that's an
it's freaking
opportunity
them
for
out.
Trump to
That's an
exploit.
opportunity for Trump,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. So he can score with all of this. Okay. Staying on the issue of Kamala Harris being a black woman, obviously, obviously, there's going to have a special appeal to African American voters. There's going to be a big push. I just want to play you this bizarre monologue from Mark Levin, who once was considered one of the bright lights on the right, now has become completely Trumpist. And unprompted, he devoted his monologue last night going right at this question of Kamala Harris's ethnicity. Let's play that.
I want to take a look at Kamala Harris with you. Excuse me, Kamala Harris right now. I'm going to tell you this. I'm not going to be a stickler about this, but the media will insist on it. Kamala Harris is not an African American. She is Indian and Jamaican. Jamaica is part of the Caribbean. India is out there near China. I only point that out because if you dare raise that, you're attacked. But the truth is she's not. And so I just wanted to make that clear. Her ancestry does not go back to American slavery. To the best of my knowledge, her ancestry doesn't go back to slavery at all. So I want to point that out because of the bizarre nature of our politics today about who is what and so forth and so on. Normally I wouldn't care. I still don't care. But I keep hearing people say she would be the first African American vice president. No, if she's elected, God forbid, or nominated and then elected, she's still not the first African American vice president. Just want to point that out. She'd be the first vice president of color, but not African American.
So, Sarah Longwell, what the hell?
Thank you, Mark Levin, for making that so clear for all of us.
There was a lot of that.
I mean,
There was a lot of that yesterday.
yeah. Well, he's just pointing it out. Look, here's the thing. This idea that we're going to pick apart her ancestry. Now, he's right. There is going to be this narrative that she is the first Black female vice president. And I think that is that's the key, right? The key is that she has lived her life in America as an American of color. And her specific heritage is interesting and worth talking about because it's good that we all know where people's experiences come from. But the idea of picking it apart to suggest that people are lying so that they can claim what specific grievances or something like that, it's just so silly.
Well, she is Black. I just thought what was interesting is though that she has the capacity, and this is going to be something that I have in the back of my mind, is that she's going to steal their word, she's going to trigger some folks on the right who just can't resist going after her ethnicity. They won't be able to help themselves. And so, sure enough, the day after she's nominated, you have the president of the United States. And what's he doing? He's tweeting out about how I'm going to protect suburban women against, I don't know, Cory Booker. I think her presence on the ticket is going to draw out certain reactions that are going to be quite revealing. I just don't know how that's going to play out. Here's another one that I actually had a Twitter exchange. By the way, you had a great tweet. Should I do your great tweet first?
Yeah, sure.
It's nice that everyone's giving Joe Biden credit for getting over Kamala's attacks during the primary, but it reminds me that Ted Cruz does not get enough credit for being totally chill about Donald Trump saying that his dad murdered JFK. Okay, that's good. That's a win. That's a good one, Sarah. So
Thank you.
I was watching as people on the right are trying to come up with various attacks on Kamala. And by the way, there's a lot of reasons why conservatives should not be happy with Kamala Harris. I mean, I get it. I've written about it. But a guy over at National Review, Dan McLaughlin, had a Twitter thread, and he starts off this way. He says, "We can talk about Harris on issues and ideology where she's been bad, but also inconsistent. What is much more consistent is her continual willingness to break norms and disdain limits on executive powers and the rule of law. The most anti-constitution candidate you could pick." Now, I responded to that by saying, "Dan, let me tell you about a man named Donald." I mean, look, this is the problem. And people go, well, you can't play whataboutism. Look, strap in for the next 40 years. Because by defending Donald Trump, by enabling Donald Trump, by rationalizing Donald Trump, you have created precedents that will come back to haunt you. So if the right is going to stand up and say, you know what I really, really dislike about Kamala Harris is her willingness to break norms and disdain limits on executive powers, people are going to laugh in your face because we've just gone through 4 years of Donald Trump. This is why we never Trumpers have been saying this is a terrible mistake. You really don't want to do this, because when a President Kamala Harris or a President AOC decides that they are going to rule with a pen and a phone, what are you going to say, people?
Yeah. I mean, I also have been very critical of Kamala Harris, specifically over her tweeting about executive orders. I mean, she and Elizabeth Warren were basically in a race on Twitter to see who could say more often, on my first day in office, I will ban this or, make this. And I cannot stand ruling by executive orders. It is one of my biggest pet peeves as a conservative because, I fetishize Congress and separation of powers and those types of things. And so, of course, that makes me crazy. The problem is that I'm staring at a president who is currently whipping off executive orders at a pace that would make Barack Obama blush. And so, what now? I'm supposed to say that is a limiting factor for her. Now, of course, it is something that makes me, in a different universe where, Marco Rubio never became a Trump sycophant and is the president of the United States, and Jeb Bush is his vice president, and is not ripping off executive orders. Of course, in that context, I would be very, and I'll still be critical of her should she continue to lean heavily on executive orders. That being said, you can't hold that up as a reason if you've been completely unwilling to stand up to Donald Trump. I mean, not only does he rule by executive order constantly, but he also does things like declare national emergencies just so he can appropriate funds from Congress. And you know what? Just because I read that Dan McLaughlin tweet too, he tweeted underneath it, well, Donald Trump, because people were piling on him, because as well they should, he said, well, but Donald Trump was constrained by his party, who is institutionally, for the Constitution and limitations on power. And I basically, it's the kind of thing that just makes me want to throw my computer out the window, because where have they been to constrain him? Yeah, where? Ben Sasse is suddenly back on the radar, but he wasn't there before.
I'm willing to welcome Ben Sasse into the light. You're still having some qualms.
No, I'm willing. No, I welcome everybody.
Okay.
Everybody to the right-wing resistance who's here to protect the Constitution from Donald Trump. I'm here for. I'm not going to forget that he was MIA during that period of time where he was drawing a Republican primary.
I think that we will. I think we'll be able to remind people of that. Okay, so I'm going to hold off on talking about the impact on the polls of Kamala Harris because we're going to find out. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. But my initial sense is that yes, she may harden Republican opposition to the ticket. She may lose some of those soft voters in the middle. But the one thing that Joe Biden did need was he needed a little bit of a jolt in the African American community, a little bit of a jolt among younger voters, and she may provide that. Okay, can we talk about the contagion of crazy? I know this is a long running theme here, but it is getting alarming. We have down in Georgia, there is I'm it's going to sound like I'm overstating it, but I'm not a QAnon conspiracy theorist woman who has been distinguished by her racism and her bigoted comments in public. So bad, her conduct was so bad that national Republicans distanced themselves from her and, more or less, under the radar, tried to make sure that she didn't get this congressional nomination. She won last night. She not only won, she won big. This is a woman named Marjorie Taylor Greene. you know, um, and you can go online and hear her, racist, Islamophobic. Actually, let's play this because this woman is about to be a new member of the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives. We may have Steve King may be gone, but he won't be forgotten and he will be replaced. This is the woman that overwhelmingly won the Republican primary in Georgia yesterday, Marjorie Taylor Greene.
There is an Islamic invasion into our government offices right now. Okay, you saw after midterm elections what we saw, so many Muslims elected. I don't know the exact number, but there were quite a few. We had that woman out of Minnesota. Now she's going into Congress and she's got to wear a head covering. They want to put their hand on the Quran and be sworn in. No, you have to be sworn in on the Bible. But we have an Islamic invasion into our government offices. Now, yes, I'll say this, we have freedom of religion in this country that protects anyone to have any kind of religion that they want. And that's great. That's one of our freedoms, right? But I'm sorry, anyone that is a Muslim that believes in Sharia law does not belong in our government.
But the generations of Black and Hispanic men, do you want to know what holds them down? Gangs. Being in gangs and dealing drugs is what holds them down. The lack of education is what holds them down. That's not a white person thing, but gangs control them. They tell the young men in their communities, don't go to school. Don't you move out of this project. Don't you move out of this community. You join this gang. And that's where you belong. You belong with us. The gangs are holding them back. It's not white people. It's crazy.
Okay, so Sarah, this morning, in case you're wondering whether she's an outlier, whether she's a rogue member, the President of the United States tweeted out, "Congratulations to future Republican star Marjorie Taylor Greene on a big congressional primary win in Georgia against a very tough and smart opponent. Marjorie is strong on everything and never gives up a real winner."
Yeah, so, and she'll be in Congress.
There may be more QAnon supporters in the Republican caucus than Trump's critics after this is all over.
After this is all over, what is crazy about that? I mean, it's funny. I have to start. I don't know what QAnon is really.
Yeah.
I like and it was a big mistake for me. Like I never went down the rabbit hole on who Donald Trump was prior because I just didn't take it seriously. But like when you have people. I only know just the very slightest bit about this conspiracy of QAnon. But that person is obviously racist. That person obviously doesn't understand what religious liberty means. You can have a debate about Sharia law, but you can't make wild, broad accusations of every Muslim fault. I mean, it's all nonsense. And in a better world would be disqualifying. And in a Republican Party, that wasn't Donald Trump's Republican Party, we would have had much better guardrails on keeping people like that out. But we don't anymore. Those people thrive in Donald Trump's Republican Party. And it also goes to show that we have a bigger problem than just Trump. And there's been some more articles written about this lately, but there is a problem with voters. And I think, it is, and it's sort of at the essence of this whole burn it all down kind of debate, because one of the things that people like Ramesh argue is, well, you can't, but you can't turn the party over to these people. That's what will happen if you don't sort of stay and fight.
Well,
and I find that to be at least a little bit compelling, because I do want to fight that person out of the party. But it is open season for them right now.
No, it is. And I think this is something that Jonathan has been writing about. Jonathan Last has been writing about that. Look, when Donald Trump leaves, the party is going to remain Trumpist. They're going to be around for a very, very long time. And we can have these intellectual debates about, where are we going on trade and what's our position on this, public policy. But the reality is that, as you put it, we have a voter problem, and that is just not going away. Hey, the other big story of the day, and I think when you look back on the trajectory of the campaign, this is a significant thing. Maybe it didn't actually happen today, but Donald Trump has given up on his signature rallies. And then there's a piece in, I'm sure you've seen this, Ashley Parker in the Washington Post. The Trump rally may be a thing of the past, at least the signature stew of tribal politics, showmanship, insults, outrage, humor, and hero worship that propelled Donald Trump's improbable victory 4 years ago. And he's saying now, he's probably not going to do it anymore because you can't have empty seats. So he's still traumatized by that Tulsa fiasco. You can't have empty seats. But, her point, though, is you can't really talk about the rise of Donald Trump without talking about the rallies. That's where he drew his psychic energy. That's where he figured out what worked and what didn't work. He was that lizard brain connected with the crowd. So it strikes me as a very big deal that Donald Trump is going into this campaign without something that was central to his personality in his campaign 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think, look, and obviously I don't know how the election's going to go, but let's say Donald Trump loses big, just loses, whatever. I do think we'll look back on the Tulsa rally as a turning point, because it was the moment when reality confronted Donald Trump in the way that only he understands, which is that the coronavirus was scary enough for people that they weren't going to show up, and that he basically was being boxed in this thing where he either had to get that psychic jolt, as you put it, by having them, but constantly being dogged by empty seats, or he had to just give them up. And giving them up, you're right, it robs him of something, and you can see it. You can see it in the press conferences, right? It's just not the same. It's why he went to Mar-a-Lago and did those executive orders, because he needs to have cheering people on his side,
right?
For him to get his mojo. Otherwise, he looks sort of robotic and mumbling and fumbling around. He just can't find that mojo without those people that are really on his side and engaging in the hero worship. It's the press is like his kryptonite, or an empty room is like his kryptonite, and that's what he's going to face for the next 2.5 months.
This is a really important point, because like yesterday I was watching the briefing, and he's very low energy, and he doesn't do well in those briefing rooms. And I've never been a Trump fan, but people who try to explain his appeal will point to him at the rallies and say, now this is peak Trump. Look how energized he is. When he tries to be funny and he's connecting with the crowd and he's riffing and he's doing all of that stuff. Well, if there are no rallies, he's not going to get that. I can't imagine how disappointed he must be about not having a national convention. I mean, this is his ultimate fantasy. This ranks right up there with the military parades for him, to be, have the huge convention hall of MAGA people, yelling, and the balloons are dropping and their flags and the big screens behind you. And there's going to be none of that. So again, we're going through something we've never gone through before, because normally in a presidential year, you have these two big conventions, which are big infomercials, and there's a bump that each candidate gets. Well, first of all, do you miss the fact that they're not going to be like real national conventions? I kind of do.
I don't. I mean, look,
I've been stupid, but I miss them.
I've been to a Republican national convention. I always find, I don't know. I mean, there's a reason people get a big bump out of them. They're not just infomercials, but you learn a lot from them, right? You learn a lot about, stars are made there. Barack Obama became president because of a speech he gave at the convention.
That's true.
There are big moments that happen. I do think, though, that the absence of them this time is a reflection on the bigger thing that's happening in the country, right? So Donald Trump, it's not just that he doesn't get to have his rallies. It's that coronavirus. And I mean, one of the things that, so the focus groups, when I start them, I always ask sort of how people are doing. How do you feel like things are
Yeah.
going in the country? And this tracks with the polling where you see that even among Republicans now, the right track, wrong track polling, people are overwhelmingly think we're on the wrong track. Overwhelmingly, they think things are going bad in the country. And when you talk to people, in the focus groups, you just ask them how things are going. What you get hit with is this barrage of pain. People whose businesses are being shut down. People who don't know what to do about their kids because they can't send them back to school. People who have health problems, but they can't address them properly because, they're so afraid to go into hospitals. I mean, it's just people are having real pain out there. And it seems like sort of the not having these bubblegum versions of politics in the convention tracks with the fact that the mood in the country right now is very grim. And, I think that just obviously bodes very poorly for an incumbent.
Well, not to give encouragement to the bedwetters out there, but everything you're saying is true. But still, here in Wisconsin, Donald Trump was within 5 points. And I was going through the various polling numbers, and somebody tweeted, how can this possibly be? How can you have 160,000 Americans are dead? We have double-digit unemployment. We have this, every single day we have an indication of the failure of this administration. And yet Biden leads in a key swing state by only 5 points. What the hell is wrong? What has to happen? This is still a competitive election, isn't it?
It is still a competitive election, and nobody should forget it. And not only is it competitive, but it's going to be the same way everything else is highly unusual. The actual election is going to be highly unusual.
Oh, yeah.
It's impossible to know what is going to happen in terms of how many people will show up to the polls, how well the polls will function, whether or not, they'll be properly staffed. There's a lot of people working on that right now. How many mail-in ballots are going to come in and how the counting's going to go? What will we know on election night? I mean, the fact is when you do polling right now and you see how many people who are going to vote for Joe Biden intend to vote by mail, it's overwhelming. And then how many people who intend to vote for Donald Trump, it's basically the reverse, who plan to show up at the polls because Trump has, developed, he's been engendering this tremendous skepticism in voting by mail. And so what you have is an environment where the people who show up at the polls on election night may overwhelmingly go for Trump. And then over time, which could be, it could be as long as a week, where all of the other ballots get counted, Joe Biden wins. And that's terrible for the country. It's terrible to have that kind of uncertainty at a time, because the whole reason that the numbers are what they are is that if this was 50 years ago, just sheer political dynamics would tell you that Donald Trump would have to lose this election, because people moved much more and they operated in this with the same information and everything else. The fact is we are so deeply polarized. We live in totally different information streams. Ann Applebaum has this excellent piece in The Atlantic where she actually did a deep dive with me on the research. And she's been doing similar research, and it's just about how this information doesn't penetrate for people, how they just live in these different information ecosystems. So anyway, the polarization is so deep that the elections and probably elections going forward in many ways are going to be decided by a shrinking group of swing voters in these key states. And that's why we're all fighting so hard to get to them.
You made a point that I wanted to just emphasize. This I couldn't pull it up right away, but the Marquette poll out of Wisconsin asked people, are you planning on voting by mail? And it was, and I'm exaggerating here, but 70% of the people voting by mail are going to vote for Biden. 70% of the people who are going to show up on the polls are going to vote for Donald Trump. I mean, it's a lot of takeaways from that, including the fact that Donald Trump may in fact be suppressing his own vote by discouraging Republicans who traditionally have dominated mail-in balloting here in Wisconsin, discouraging them from doing it. But you're right, you have two different electorates, which then raises the stakes about Donald Trump's attempt to mess with mail-in voting and the games he might play with the Postal Service and all of that, because you have, it seems like two different electorates. But I have so many fears, but one of them, and I think you alluded to this. So on election night, if you count the ballots of the same day election, Donald Trump might be able to claim victory on election night and then watch as these these Democratic votes come in. And people need to understand that's just the way it's counted. But the Republicans are going to try to make it sound like it's something nefarious, that we won this and they're trying to take it away from us. And that's where you get to a really ugly period. That's 78 days between the election and the inauguration. So anyway. Yeah, here we are. It's just going to get worse. I had so many other things I wanted to ask you about. Why are you not on my podcast more often?
You should have me on a lot more often. Can I just say just
Yeah.
on you just made I think a pretty essential point that I think is worth underscoring for people. I've been doing a lot of these scenario planning exercises where I actually played, Team Trump to say how might we react on election night. And the thing is that because there are going to be so many mail-in ballots, let's just say hypothetically there are some instances where people have mailed it in, but they also show up at the polls. And then imagine how those what are probably going to be limited instances, but let's say it happens in a few places because it's all imperfect.
Sure.
And there can be human error and all of this stuff. It doesn't all have to be nefarious, but Fox News begins to blow those up into major concerns. And then Bill Barr, Bill Kristol talks about this all the time. I think it's really true that Donald Trump will have the levers of the federal government at his disposal. I mean, you look at what they're doing with Kanye right now. The Wisconsin GOP in your state, they
Yep.
they walked this ballots in to make sure Kanye can get on the ballot. Like this is happening in broad daylight. Donald Trump tweeted very specifically, and we should pay attention to this, that the election must be called on election night.
Right.
Well, why
Right.
is he saying that? It's because he absolutely knows that the in-person polling is going to play in his favor. And with people so polarized, this election, the stakes feeling so high, it is worth being nervous and also worth taking every precaution that we can up front, whether that's helping the media understand that they should not set expectations of the election being called on election night, whether that's making sure that there are lots of young people available to work at the polls and people should go volunteer if they're young and healthy, to make sure that, this is why this federal bill that we were waiting on that Trump's, whipping off executive orders about, Congress needs to come to some kind of an agreement because there's a bunch of money for election funding in there that's necessary to make sure that in this very weird pandemic environment, we can pull off a safe and secure election.
Look, we need to come back to this, but I am absolutely convinced that, look, this is very much on Trump brand to declare victory on election night, to create a reality, and then imply that every other piece of information is bogus. I mean, look what Bill Barr was able to do with the Mueller report. Get out in front, basically declare a reality, and then dare everybody else to catch up. And none of us expected that he would be as successful as he was then. But this is Donald Trump. Just if you can't have a reality, you create the reality. I think a lot of people remember one of the decisive moments in the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, and I don't want to relitigate that, was the fact that the networks called it for Bush that night. And therefore, at least initially, which then created, I think it was Fox News, and then created that narrative that he's won the election. Are we going to overturn the Bush victory? And everything that happened after that flowed from, who basically was the squatter, who seized the mountain and said, I'm not leaving. So yeah, this is something that I think that it's not only something to be concerned about, it's something to actually expect. Sarah Longwell, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming back. We have to have you on again very soon.
Thanks, Charlie.
And thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow and we will do this all over again.